This is Dust, Documents and Diamonds, a podcast about history, researching history, and the joy of finding diamonds when we search the archives for the dust of past lives. Most dear and loving Mother, seeing that, by the severity of the law, by the wickedness of our time, and by God's holy ordinance and appointment, my days in this life are cut off. Of duty and conscience I am bound, being far from you in body, but in spirit very near you, not only to crave your daily blessing, but also to write these few words unto you. You have been a most loving, natural, and careful mother unto me. You have suffered great pains in my birth and bringing up. You have toiled and travailed to feed and sustain me, your first and eldest child. And therefore for these and all other your motherly cherishing I give you most humble and hearty thanks, wishing that it lay in me to show myself as loving and natural and dutiful a son, as you have showed yourself, a most tender and careful mother. But I cannot express my love, show my duty, declare my affection, testify my goodwill towards you. So little I am able for to do, and so much I think myself bound unto you. I had meant this spring to have seen you, if God had granted me my health and liberty. But now never shall I see you or any of yours in this life again, trusting yet in heaven to meet you, to see you, and to live everlastingly with you. These were the lines with which a young man called William Hart opened a letter to his mother, written in 1583, shortly before he was executed, for having, as a priest, reconciled people to the Church of Rome. The main section of his letter interprets his impending death in terms familiar to anyone who has studied early modern martyrdom: the truth of the cause, the bliss of heaven, the glory of suffering for Christ. But, strikingly, it opens by acknowledging what is broken. The mother's travail and cherishing are not requited by the son's returning care. Hart stresses this fundamental bond while acknowledging that it goes unfulfilled. The conduct of a natural and dutiful son is impossible. There is the hint of a further failure in that he is the eldest child, whose society expected to take the chief responsibility in the family. In the closing section of his letter, Hart returns to this broken circle ever more starkly. If I had lived, I would have holpen you in your age, as you have holpen me in my youth. But now I must desire God to help you and my brethren, for I cannot. Hart's letter painfully acknowledges the emotional and social bond which is being broken, yet admits no doubt of the rightness of the choices which break it. The calling of God has to take precedence. In this episode, I want to explore how religious commitment and religious conflict could strain, even break, family ties, and yet, at the same time, was closely bound up with them. But just to recap briefly the situation of English Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation. When England became a Protestant confessional state, Catholicism became a forbidden religion. Laws against Catholic practice gradually ramped up, driven by concern that the old religion wasn't going to die naturally after all, by the hazards of international politics, and by the fears that haunted most confessional states of religious dissidents as potential rebels. By the 1580s, the legal situation was, in outline, thus: all subjects over 16 years old were required to attend Protestant church services each Sunday. Those who refused could be convicted as recusants and risked heavy fines along with various official and semi-official harassment. From 1571, it was a capital crime, punished as treason, to bring into the country any official document issued by a pope, or to call the Queen a heretic or schismatic. Those two are religious terms, of course, which basically mean saying that her religion is a false form of Christianity. And from 1581 it was legally treason to be reconciled to the Catholic Church, to reconcile anyone to the Catholic Church, or to persuade someone to be reconciled. From 1585 it was treason for an Englishman ordained as a Catholic priest to enter the kingdom and remain there. It was also a felony, so a hanging offence, to receive, aid or harbour a priest. This law was known as the Act Against Seminary Priests and Jesuits. A seminary is a priest's training college, and the Jesuits are a Catholic religious order properly called the Society of Jesus. In 1604, James I confirmed all the Elizabethan laws against Catholics, and they remained the law until the 18th century. There were some additions of further fines or restrictions on convicted recusants, which means Catholics who refused to go to Protestant churches and had been convicted of that offence. Under these laws, about 270 Catholics were executed between 1577 and 1681, most of them under the 1585 Act Against Seminary Priests and Jesuits. It's been estimated that 22% of priests sent to England during Elizabeth's reign were executed. Other Catholics, we don't know the precise number, were imprisoned for long or short times, and many of them paid fines of varying amounts. Now, there is a long history, as it were, of regarding the post-Reformation history of English Catholicism as one of seigneurial religion. That's historian jargon from seigneur, French, meaning a lord, and so a seigneurial religion means dependent on lordship. In other words, people had the impression that Catholicism survived in little islands of Catholic landed gentry households where clandestine domestic chaplains said masses for Catholic gentry and some of their servants. Now, the importance of gentry patronage for the survival of Catholicism is very real, but the story of English Catholicism was never as cosy, as homogeneous, or as simple as that. Families split along religious lines. Young people converted to Catholicism against their parents' wishes. Parents who were rubbing along with a certain amount of church-going to keep the law off their back, along with a quiet Catholicism on the side, found that their children considered them lily-livered schismatics, that they had fallen from the true unity of the church even if they didn't hold any actual Protestant beliefs. Catholics from well below the ranks of the landed gentry grappled with the problems of faith and compromise, sought Catholic education for their children, and involved themselves with the networks that sustained the risky activities of clandestine priests. All this constantly impinged on those family ties and hierarchies which were so central to society at that time, as they did all over Europe in this stormy age. Young people rejected their parents' religion, disobeyed their injunctions, left their parents' homes, impelled, they declared, by a higher obedience and a higher love. Christian theologians of all confessions endorsed such disobedience. The commandments said you must obey your parents, but not if they told you to sin, and to ignore God's call was sin. Even without disagreement over belief, in Catholic countries young people might still choose a heavenly father against an earthly one if they followed a call to the monastery or the priesthood. The Catholic Church insisted, against state and patriarchal authority, on the autonomy of young people to take religious vows. Yet the letter we started with, William Hart's, shows how the English mission in which he had invested his life was inseparable from family ties, even as it also seems to strain them. To explore this, we need to turn to the place, well, one of the places, where the English mission came from, the English College in Rome. The English College is a training college for priests. Founded by Gregory XIII in 1579, its original students were defying the English state by going to Rome to train as priests, and were committing a capital crime by returning to England. When they arrived at the college, they had to answer the college's entry questionnaire, which asked questions about their education, family, and religious history. The statements these youths wrote in response survive in their hundreds, and are a source of endless entertainment, at least as far as I'm concerned. The last question on the form asked what the students' purpose in entering the college was. Most answered that they were willing to be ordained and go to England. But some elaborated on the formula, and their words can be revealing. One youth, Richard Fisher, described how he left for Rome against his parents' anguished opposition, and then wrote that, "When it please God and you, I will return to the fatherland to strengthen my kin, whom I hold so dear." Or there was John Gross, a convert from a Protestant family, who wrote that since his conversion, "I have strained every strength and sinew of nature, so that, with the help of God, who works all things in all men by his grace, I might convert my brothers." Oh, and just to note, they were writing in Latin, as you did back then, and I'm translating their words. In this formulation, natural bonds and divine grace work together. Nature compels John to convert his heretic relatives, and thus to the college at Rome. Grace will enable his purpose. By emphasizing giving spiritual help to their kin, these young men make priesthood and the mission a way of reforging ties broken, or strained anyway, by their conversion. This is seen also in William Hart's letter, which hints at efforts to convert his mother. "Read that book I gave you," he asks, "and die a member of Christ's church." Incidentally, I do not get the impression from his letter that Mrs. Hart was a convinced Protestant. It sounds much more as though she is Catholic by inclination, but outwardly conforms to the established church. Her son's plea is for her to be sacramentally reconciled to the Catholic Church, and presumably to separate from the Protestant Church by recusancy. These kinds of sentiments were not, of course, exclusive to Catholics. John Fox, the famed historian of Protestant martyrs, printed in his book Acts and Monuments 2 letters from the Protestant martyr Nicholas Shetterden to his mother, which exhort her to convert, insist on his affection and obedience, and contrast worldly welfare with the heavenly bliss promised to martyrs. Shetterden's exhortation ends with the double-edged promise, "So shall we meet in joy at the last day, or else I bid you farewell for evermore." By warning that the hoped-for reunion depends on conversion, Shetterden made explicit something which nags uneasily beneath a letter like William Hart's. Hart urged, "Beseech him heartily to make you a member of his church, and that he will save your soul. Die a member of Christ's body, and then one day we shall meet in heaven by God's grace." There is an anxious undercurrent of conditionality beneath the earnest offer of comfort. Now, letters by children exhorting their parents were in fact a lively subgenre of writing at this time, with a number of published examples, both Protestant and Catholic. One of the earliest and better known is Robert Southwell's Epistle of a Reverend Priest unto his Father. Southwell was a Jesuit missionary and also a pretty good poet. He was executed in 1595. His father was probably a conformist, attending the state church and keeping his Catholic sympathies discreet. Obviously, this wasn't good enough for his Jesuit son, who wasn't going to allow conventions of social hierarchy to stop him saving his father's soul. But in his letter, Southwell speaks first of being driven by filial affection, the original law of nature, he calls it, and only then of following God's command in seeking his father's salvation. Southwell goes on to reverse the father-son roles by appealing to his priesthood. Priests are spiritual fathers, so he has, in a sense, become the father, and his father the prodigal son. To quote, "He may be a father to the soul that is a son to the body, and requite the benefit of his temporal life by reviving his parent from a spiritual death." And just to illustrate how this was a cross-confessional thing, we may look at a little book published by a Protestant urging his mother to convert from Catholicism. Anthony Hungerford's Advice of a Son opens by saying that, "Seeing it hath pleased God to appoint you the mean of my being in the world, and that by God's law he owes her obedience, therefore he must, as he says, under peril of a curse, desire her salvation, and write a long tract against her Catholic faith in order to bring it about." So God, who is the source of obligation to parents, also limits it, and causes it sometimes to take the form of opposition. All these letters, of course, grappled with the problem that when a young person defended a creed opposite to that of his or her parents, this threatened the paradigm in which parents taught and guided children. It not only implies defiance, but claims a moral authority over the parent, who is urged to follow in the child's footsteps. Yet writers do not aim to simply overturn these accepted hierarchies. That would do their cause no good. Rather, they try to negotiate them, trying to portray young converts as good, dutiful children, even while they totally invert expectations about how children and parents relate. So, some writers take great care to reconcile spiritual vocation and family bonds on the level of ideas. But there are also clues about the practical importance of kinship to the operations of missionary priests. For example, among the files of the Elizabethan government from the 1580s are 2 letters from young Englishmen who were studying for the Catholic priesthood in France. They are there because they were intercepted by government agents. In one letter, a chap called George Powell wrote in 1585 to his loving and dear father to ask a favour. "For the love you bear me, that your worship will welcome this bearer, and make much of him, for he made much of me whilst he stayed here." George goes on to add that the bearer, that is, the man carrying the letter, and his company, shall, and I quote again, "have much need of every man's helps, for they shall be with you peradventure today, and in another place tomorrow, and you will have great merit, and they will pray for you." Now, this veiled language very much suggests that the bearer is a priest. The writer shifts from polite commendations into something more urgent, as he warns that if his father should keep your money for yourself, perhaps you should be cast headlong into everlasting damnation. Which sounds like it's rather more than just that you're asking him to be polite to a friend of yours. In 1580, the student Robert Debdale also wrote from the seminary to his parents. After dutiful greetings, he too commends the bearer, whom he calls "my especial friend Mr. Cottam, who hath been unto me the 2/2 of my life. I cannot sufficiently commend unto you his loving kindness showed and bestowed upon me, wherefore I beseech you to take counsel of him in matters of great weight." Robert also sends small gifts, including some Catholic contraband, a gilded crucifix and rosary beads. Mr. Cottam was actually Thomas Cottam, the priest who crossed to England in June 1580 and was executed in 1582. Now, these letters, and of course there may have been others that got away, indicate that seminary priests were carrying correspondence from students at the exiled colleges to their families, which simultaneously served as references, adding to their contacts in England and facilitating their mission. Obviously, this kind of networking functioned only where students had Catholic kin, but Catholic could be a broad category. Your family did not have to be highly committed hardline recusants to be counted on to receive a priest and not turn him in. Evidence of how the English mission used kin networks can be seen in the number of Rome students who said their conversion and or vocation had been influenced by a relative who was a priest, often an uncle. 3 kinsmen of the Jesuit priest Richard Holtby recorded their own and their parents' conversions as due to him. So, for example, George Holtby said that his parents were schismatics, and he himself was ignorant of all religions in the mud of heresy before Uncle Richard's intervention. It was a less tactful age, ecumenically speaking. Now, it's clear that their formal conversion was carefully planned. George's father moved from Yorkshire to County Durham to avoid his existing neighbours noticing so sudden a change. Richard Holtby then arrived while they were still moving in, and, after reconciling the parents, began to solicit me, that's George, with pious exhortations to embrace the Catholic faith. 2 other kinsmen of Father Holtby told similar stories of themselves and their parents becoming Catholic. Richard Holtby's kinship network was clearly important to his mission. His relatives were his contacts, his harbourers, and his spiritual flock. And while Holtby aimed to bring them to a committed, recusant Catholicism, this was not a prerequisite. He was contacting conformist kin, relying on family bonds for their support and silence, because of course they committed a felony in receiving him, and hoping to bring them to what he believed was full commitment. Of course, it didn't always work out so well. One young priest called Edmund Jennings headed straight to London when he reached England to find his long-lost brother. But he was greeted with a rant from said brother about his delinquent brother, Edmund, who would totally get hanged if he ever came home. Things didn't much improve when Edmund revealed himself. John essentially said, "Okay, I won't turn you in, but please go away and never come back." The twist is that we know about this because after Edmund was in fact hanged, John had a change of heart. And 20 years later he wrote a book about his brother's martyrdom and his own conversion. Some priests worked a long way from where they had grown up, but others, like Richard Holtby, utilised kinship networks. Using kinship to facilitate Catholic mission was pragmatic, but it was also about belief. If you seriously believed that following false religion led to hell, to seek the conversion of one's kin was indeed a natural imperative as well as a spiritual one. For another example of how religious mission and family ties were both connected and competing, we can turn to the letters of William Blundell, a Catholic gentleman from Little Crosby in Lancashire. This is late in the 17th century, and the situation of English Catholics was very different in the reign of Charles II than in the reign of Elizabeth I. But they still operated in a framework where the presence of priests was a crime and assisting them was also a crime. William Blundell's eldest and his 3rd son both became Jesuit priests. The elder, Nicholas, was sent to England in 1677. William Blundell wrote in February 1678 to his cousin Roger Bradshaw, who was a Member of Parliament, asking him, essentially, to befriend Nicholas in London. But Bradshaw was not a Catholic. As Blundell wrote in a separate letter to Nicholas himself, his own religion is such that he is no friend at all to ours. And so the letter to Bradshaw uses disguised language. His son, Blundell says, after many years' absence abroad, came lately to London. As for his priesthood, Blundell remarked coyly that, because he hath been absent so long, and is known to be a piece of a scholar, he is, in some men's fancies, the Lord knows what. Bradshaw could, one senses, have deduced easily, if he didn't actually know, that Nicholas Blundell had spent the last 20 years at the English Jesuit school of St. Omer's in Flanders, and was a Catholic Jesuit priest. Yet Blundell was confident that the bonds of kinship would outweigh the threats of the 1585 statute, which would make Bradshaw a felon for harbouring his cousin's son. Perhaps it was to secure Bradshaw's goodwill that Blundell opened this letter with some strongly loyalist comments on the current war with France, and also assured Sir Roger that "I shall not scruple to answer for his good behaviour," meaning Nicholas, obviously. Blundell also wrote at some length to Nicholas himself, recommending that he should call on Bradshaw, and here there is an undercurrent of the anxious father, more concerned than he will acknowledge about his son's safety. The risks of the English mission were much less than they had been 90 or 70 years before, but arrest and imprisonment were still real hazards, and that summer, 1678, would see the beginning of the Titus Oates hysteria. This revolved around an entirely imaginary Catholic plot to kill King Charles II, in which more and more Catholics, priests and others, were accused in a snowballing witch hunt over the next 2 or so years. This sudden resurgence of lethal persecution claimed 24 victims. They included a friend of William Blundell's, the lawyer Richard Langhorne. So we see Blundell reminding his son that Bradshaw is a Protestant, but, he says, "To me and all mine he hath always been incomparably faithful and loving, and you need not to doubt his kindness." Which means he won't turn you in. He took care, though, to advise Nicholas in some detail on Bradshaw's character and preferences. "He loves not formality or compliments, and humble confidence, however, doth gain his heart." Nicholas should ask after Sir Roger's wife, children, and grandsons. Blundell reminds him of the details of their names. And he should, of course, thankfully acknowledge his singular great favours to me, especially in my greatest troubles. Now this refers to the civil wars, when the parliamentarians had confiscated Blundell's estates, and Bradshaw had helped him to repurchase them. But Nicholas must express his gratitude once or twice at the most, and not too suddenly. When you read it, you can almost see the eye roll from Nicholas. "Yes, Dad, I will remember to ask after his wife and children. No, Dad, I will not wear my Jesuit gown on Cheapside." All these minute instructions to please do, though, I think, indicate an awareness of the risk Nicholas took in seeking patronage from a non-Catholic kinsman. The gain would be that if Nicholas established good personal relations, then, should he get arrested, Bradshaw's protection might ensure him against the worst consequences. And yet, William Blundell's postscript to Nicholas suggests just how open a secret it was that Bradshaw would be feloniously receiving a Catholic priest in his kinsman. If Sir Roger do inquire concerning his nephews at Flamstead, I think you ought to answer plainly, without show of any distrust. Flamstead was the pseudonym, the alias, for St. Omer's School, the Jesuit school. Blundell's second letter to Bradshaw, thanking him for his kind answer and promising a visit from his son, indicates that Bradshaw was indeed willing to receive his outlawed cousin. It seems safe to say that he did so in what you might call plausible deniability, rather than actual ignorance. Nicholas Blundell also spent some time among his family at Little Crosby near Liverpool. William Blundell assured the Jesuit superior that he did not apprehend any danger from the neighbourhood by my son's coming to see us, which means that even if Nicholas were recognised, nobody would report him. He also added that, "I trust he, Nicholas, is armed sufficiently against all disturbance of mind. In seeing his younger brother, who was now of course the heir because he had given up his inheritance, and I quote again, in the possession of such worldly comfort as he himself hath relinquished." In this, I think, Blundell acknowledges the unease caused by the disruption in rank and hierarchy when an eldest son resigned his responsibilities, even with his father's blessing. Blundell emphatically renounces any paternal authority, as he tells the Jesuit superior that he submits the matter to the pleasure of those unto whom I have totally resigned him long afore. He offers only the plea of affection. True it is that I myself, with his mother and other friends, shall be heartily glad to see him, after an absence so long. Father Blundel's visit to Lancashire was not denied, and while at Little Crosby he baptised one of his brother's children. Nicholas may have been a Jesuit priest, but he remained very much a Blundell of Little Crosby. Now we've seen that seminary priests, often converts, linked their mission especially to the conversion of their kin. For some, this filial piety overlapped with another kind of bond. Here's another of these young converts, called John Everard, explaining his motivation. To one freeing the soul of his brother, a crown is owed, not of oak leaves, as was given by the Romans for serving the citizen, but of immortal glory. That to me is prime among vows. To be sent into England, that in so difficult a work as her conversion, united with other workers, I might spend the talents which God has given to me. And again I'm translating the Latin. Everard had noted that his siblings were heretics, and he says, unless they are swiftly converted to the faith, they shall burn, being thrown into the eternal fire. As I've said, early modern Christians were nothing if not forthright. Now the brothers he wishes to save are literal brothers, but they are also his compatriots, his fellow Englishmen, the metaphor of nation as family. Everard combines the ideas of piety towards kin and towards fatherland, both of them consciously modelled on ancient Rome. That's the reference to the Romans honouring one who serves the citizen, and he compares that to converting his brother. Now, I'm going to look a bit further at this intertwining of family and patria, fatherland, in the context of the English mission. To do that, we need to go back to the English college, and two kinds of historical source found there. The first is some of those students' entry questionnaires, like the ones I've already quoted. The second are sermons preached by scholars of the English college. Now, sermons were way more interesting then than they are usually considered now. They were a major form of public communication. They could press at hot-button issues, they could inspire crowds, and they can give us a window onto how people thought about the key questions of their lives and deaths, as well as the smaller questions of which politicians to hate and which hobbies to avoid. Before there were celebrity TV presenters, there were celebrity preachers. Now, the sermons I'm looking at here included those preached before the Pope in the great chapel of his palace, and some preached in the English college before a congregation of English students, pilgrims, the local faithful, and some visiting dignitaries like, cardinals. The links between the language of family and of nation are not hard to spot. Fellow citizens as brothers, the word fatherland, the word nation from Latin natio, derived from birth. Although the Latin word patria, fatherland, suggests male parenthood, it is actually a feminine noun, grammatically speaking, which invites metaphors of motherhood. Also in the background is the Catholic metaphor as the church as mother and God as father. And one subject that, like my research at the moment, explores is how the Catholic mission to England was seen by its members as a patriotic endeavour. The idea of saving the fatherland from the oppression of false religion, and thus martyrdom as being a kind of patriotic sacrifice as well as a religious one. And that was a conscious, deliberate challenge to the law which executed Catholic priests as traitors, betrayers of the Queen and fatherland. They don't just respond, not traitors, but martyrs. They insist, not traitors, but patriots. And that's the cultural background in which one student from a Catholic family, but with some Protestant relatives, might say that he hoped one day that I might teach my kin the true and Catholic faith, and also that I have vowed myself entirely to the fatherland, and to it have invested all my care, deeds, and labour. Or again, one youth, his name was Christopher Mannering, wrote in 1617 that certainly the entire world holds nothing more glorious than that one should pour out his last blood and his spirit for the fatherland and for Christ. Sounds a bit like Christopher Mannering had been reading Horace's ode with its famous line, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for the fatherland. But his words even more closely echo a sermon preached in 1586 by an English college student to Pope Sixtus V, which I will quote in translation. Just as no one has greater love than that he should lay down his breath for his friends, so there is no better, no fairer terms for seeking death, than if one shall pour out for the salvation of the fatherland his blood and spirit. Now the preacher here, his name was William Baldwin, adapted Christ's declaration, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends, into a patriotic assertion. The Latin word amicus hovers in the midst of this linguistic triangle of family, church, and nation, since in early modern usage it could also mean kin. So amicus could mean friends, but it could also mean your kin. And here he's taking amicus, friends, and making it mean your fellow countrymen. So both Mannering and Baldwin, who I've just quoted, speak of blood being offered pro salute patriae, for the fatherland's salvation. Again, not at all surprising in the context of martyrdom. Pouring out blood not only denotes death, but has connotations of sacrifice, and in particular of the Eucharist, held by Catholics to be the offering of Christ's body and blood. But the word blood also has a link with kinship, hence the term blood relations. Drawing attention to blood being shed by your countrymen thus implies a kind of fratricide, brothers killing brothers. And if fratricide by fellow countrymen, then also filicide, killing one's children. The image of the patria as mother could be reversed into a murderous parody. Now, Robert Southwell, we mentioned him earlier, wrote a sort of report about the executions of Catholics in 1588, which was, of course, the year of the Spanish Armada. And the way he puts it is this: our rulers, after the peril of the Armada had passed, and the army which they had enrolled on land had been disbanded, turned their arms from foreign foes against their own sons, and with inhuman ferocity vented the hatred they had conceived against the Spaniards on their own fellow citizens and subjects. Now, viscera, the term translated as sons, means literally heart, womb, or bowels, and figuratively it means offspring or children. So the disembowelment inflicted on Catholics as condemned traitors is evoked because, of course, the punishment for treason involved the person being hanged, but then cut down and vivisected, basically, often while still alive, right? So this thing of viscera, meaning children but also bowels, it directly relates to that particular method of execution. It becomes this image of filicide, of England murdering her children, or even of suicide, of England somehow, as England suicidally rips out her own guts. England turns on her own viscera, her own children, her own guts. But if the patria could be imagined as a murderous mother, she could also be a victim. Thomas Lister, in another sermon to the Pope in 1582, asked, "What injury of her children, what filthiness, what destruction has unhappy Britannia not seen through these years? How many of her children has she suffered the butchery of? Of how many of those whom she brought forth hath she been forced to drink the blood?" Now this metaphor kind of compounds filicide with cannibalism, yet rather than a murderess, the nation or the land is a co-victim, forced to drink her children's blood. And this kind of elision, making the country a sort of co-victim of, the heretic Protestant tyranny, along with its Catholic sons, was the goal, to be honest, of much English Catholic rhetoric. It's to see England as a victim of heresy. Now, the flip side of that cultural assumption of making Catholic mission patriotic was to imagine Protestantism as somehow betraying the nation. And yes, of course, this was totally reversing the official narrative, and of course it was meant to be daring and provocative. Now, so take an example, a Trinity Sunday sermon, which is preached at the English College in Rome, this is 1582, invoked by name a number of English Catholic martyrs, using language that was heroic and sanguineous, shall we say, in fairly equal measure. But the preacher then continued, "Who is there among us so iron hard that if he saw a sick parent fallen into madness, he would not be moved rather to pity than to hatred? Our fatherland, by which, just as with parents, all the universal laws of piety are claimed, labours as though afflicted by a heavy madness, and even tries to kill her own doctors. And therefore shall we be deterred from making the cure?" So here we have the fatherland as parents and the inhabitants as children. Heresy, Protestantism, is imagined as madness, and Catholic missionaries as doctors. The doctors, whom England attempts to kill, are also her sons, and so there is again that sense of filicide. And this metaphor of madness goes one step further than making England the victim of heresy. A madman may commit harmful acts, for which nevertheless he is not guilty. If England is mad, she is, as they say, not herself. She is not really responsible for her actions. Now, the common theme between talking about heresy as slavery and as madness and so on is seeing Protestantism as something which prevents England from being itself. Madness is an aberration from the patient's true nature. Protestantism is an aberration from England's true Catholic nature. Oh, and yes, obviously these people were well aware of the official narrative whereby being English means being Protestant, and Catholicism is foreign and alien, and Catholics are all traitors. They were quite deliberately turning their enemy's rhetoric on its head. They were appealing to what they saw as an older, truer Englishness, which was entwined with Catholic religion. And here's one more example, a very vivid one, from a description of a martyr called Ambrose Barlow, who was executed in 1641, and it's also in Latin. Here the writer is addressing England herself. "Those who by the gallows and by the cruel scrutiny of their bowels with iron you destroy, dead show you their heart. Out of those I offer one Ambrose Barlow, so well disposed towards you, his common mother, with such great Christian charity, that the foresaid kind of death, which the butchers brought to him by your order, had been for a long time most desirable to him, from which thus by his opened body and poured out guts he might make his affection towards you obvious to you, if impiety did not blind the eyes of your mind." Now, the writer emphasizes equally England's guilt for her son's death, and that it is meant to benefit her. The mother's destruction of her son is what proves his affection. The literal showing to the spectators of a condemned traitor's heart torn out of his body during execution is what shows his heart, in the metaphorical sense of showing a person's truest intentions. In this case, his sincere affection for the mother country. Such vivid portrayals of violent martyrdom are meant both to arouse emotions of pity and admiration, and to portray martyrs as driven by emotions, by forceful bonds tying them both to Christ and to the patria, the fatherland. The last two examples also show particularly well how the blood metaphor was useful, because it was not solely a metaphor. It packs emotional punch, because the hearers know that, while the labelling might be symbolic, the substance was entirely real. The blood of executed English priests literally fell onto the ground and soaked into English soil. They literally showed their hearts in death. So, what I'm trying to say is that English Catholics saw themselves within this triangle of nation, family, and faith. They used ideas of family to imagine the nation and bind together their religious identity and their national identity. And this was reflected in the practicalities of Catholic networks, relying on family ties to get around the laws. Faith sometimes conflicted with the social expectations of family ties and kinship. But bonds of kinship, nation, and faith also reinforced each other in sustaining English Catholic resistance. Thank you for listening to Dust, Documents and Diamonds. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a review and share the link. You can also find @DustDocsDiamond on x.com and post your questions and comments.